Back in the late 1800s, a fellow named Hiram Nicholas created a small village. Actually, it was just a bump in the road near the Colorado-Kansas border. Yeah, he started off with a very, very small store to serve people in the area, and he would grow vegetables and he would have basic things to sell. Out of that came the town of Nicholas, Colorado. Now, Nicholas is so close to the Kansas-Colorado border that as you drive on Interstate 70, you probably won't even see the town except for the one gas station sign right off the highway. And if you lived in Nicholas and you went to sleep and you rolled out of bed in your sleep, likely as not, you'd be in Kansas. Well, the town of Nicholas over the years grew not a whole lot, but it had several hundred people. And the people in Nicholas loved their Christmas holiday. Well, because it was so barren and bleak there were only a few trees along the river, and they were cottonwoods. So at Christmas time, they certainly wouldn't be good for decoration. And so one of the things that the folks did is that every November, they'd have a big chili cook-off. And from the proceeds of that, they gather their money together, and several of the folks would drive into Fort Collins, Colorado, and they would buy the biggest evergreen tree they could find, brought that one back, and put it in the town square, decorated it with lights, and celebrated their Christmas. But one particular year, it was a dreadful year for no rain. The drought was so severe that the wheat crops were struggling to survive, even the winter wheat. The cows and horses couldn't be watered by the natural springs. So, the farmers would have to go and buy water to feed their cattle and their livestock. It was a really difficult time. It was so difficult, in fact, that when November came around for them to have their chili cook-off to raise money for their Christmas tree, no one had the money to buy the chili. And it was just depressing. And so people wandered around that village just muttering to themselves because there just was no hope. They had no money for a Christmas tree or for decorations. Now, young Edie, who was 9 years old, her father was in charge of the city's water supply. And on the top of the hill overlooking the town was a huge water tank. Now, it was an unusual shape. Most water tanks are big and round. This one was just as square like a box as could be on four stubby legs. And then the name of the town, Nicholas, was on the top so that airplanes who were lost looking around could look down and say, oh, there's Nicholas, Colorado. I know where I am now. Well, as I said, it was a really depressing time. And Edie, who loved her Christmas, finally one day said to her dad, I've got an idea. We can't buy a Christmas tree this year, but I'll bet we could decorate that water tank and make it into a Christmas present. And her dad looked at her and said, well, that's probably the only use we're going to make of the tank. It is bone dry. The drought has taken away all of our water, but maybe that's a good idea. So he gathered together some of the folks in town, went to the police department. There were only 2 policemen. He went to the fire department, only 1 fireman. He went to the local grocery store and talked to the manager there. He talked to some of the farmers at the co-op. And they all agreed, yeah, we could make that big water tank into a big present. And so the first thing they gathered were blue tarps. There were a few of those because, as you may recall, on the eastern part of Colorado, the wind blew like blazes. So it wasn't unusual for somebody to lose their roof where they had to do the blue tarp over the top to keep the water out. So they had plenty of those. So they gathered those together, they kind of stitched them together, and they wrapped that entire water tank in the blue tarps. Now, once they did that, they said, now, we need to kind of decorate this. And a contractor locally said, I've got some leftover installation, and it's got that silver backing on it. And so they took some of those pieces, stripped out very narrow strips of that silver backing, and they made it into ribbon and put that around that big old water tank. And they even had a bow. And then one of the folks said, well, what are we going to do for lights? And little Edie said, well, don't we put the lights down and store them for the Christmas tree every year somewhere in the town hall? And they said, yeah, that's it. So they gathered all those lights out. And then the local high school basketball team members volunteered to go up and put those lights all over that big old tank. Well, when they all got all done, people kind of stood back and looked at it and said, that's awesome. They had the biggest, longest electrical cord they could find. They drug it all the way out. And then the mayor of the town and the local firemen got together, and they took the two ends of the extension cord. It was dark by then, and people in the town were going around waiting, and they plugged it in, and the lights went on, and it was spectacular. People cheered and laughed, and the whole idea of the Christmas spirit came back to them. And they were so excited with it, and every night they'd plug in those lights, and those lights would make that big old tank look like the biggest Christmas present you'd ever seen. People were so excited. They were back now. They had their Christmas parties or their Hanukkah parties. They had a wonderful opportunity to share things together because they weren't within the COVID area, so they could socially gather. And a lot of the women brought out their cookies and they traded those. It was wonderful. Now come Christmas Eve, Edie's father said to Edie, you've done a wonderful job, a great idea, and now it's time for you to go to sleep because, Santa won't come unless you're sleeping. Well, Edie is 9 years old, but she said, okay, Dad, I'll do that. So she went into her bedroom and pulled the quilt over her head and went to sleep. About midnight, the phone in the house rang. It was very loud. And Edie woke up, sat up in bed, and listened as her father answered the phone. Hello? Hello? What? The water tank? Who's at the water tank? Well, what does he look like? Okay, red coat and a long white beard. Maybe that's old man Frederick. He wanders around a lot in the evening. No, it wasn't. No, you already saw Frederick. He was downtown. Huh? Well, what else do you see there? Animals. How many? 8? What are they? Horses, cows? You don't know. Well, what do you mean somebody is now, that fellow's going over to the tank and starting to fiddle with the opening thing? There's no water in the tank. What? Somebody's trying to damage the tank. I'll be right there. And her dad hung up the phone. Well, Edie wanted to see what was going on. She was wide awake. So she put on her shoes and she wrapped herself in the quilt and she ran outside and jumped behind the back seat of her dad's pickup so he wouldn't see her. He ran out. A couple of minutes later, he'd gotten his clothes all on and was ready to go. Jumped in the truck and started it up and drove as fast as he could out of town, over the road, up until the crazy old dirt road up to the tank, skidded from side to side, pulled to a stop, and there in front of him were a bunch of animals. And this fella, her dad got out of the truck and raced up the hill to the tank. Edie, at the same time, she got out of the truck, wrapped herself in the blanket because it was really cold, but she didn't want her dad to see her. So she kind of hid to the side of the truck and looked over the top to watch. Her dad marched up to this fella and said, who are you? And what is your name? He said, well, my name is Nicholas. And I've got these animals who have been working all night, and they're very thirsty. And I noticed as I was coming by that there was that name, my name, on the top of this great big box water tank saying Nicholas. And I said, hey, that's for me. They must be waiting for me. So I came on down here to try to get some water for my animals. Well, Edie's dad looked at him and said, what kind of animals are those? They don't look like anything I've seen before. Well, Nicholas said, well, they're reindeer, and they've been working really hard. Well, Edie's dad said, that's fine, but we don't have any water. I'm sorry. Well, Nicholas said, maybe you just ought to try, open it up. I think there's water in there. Oh, no, there's not water. Well, why don't you just give it a try? Well, finally, Edie's dad went over, and there was a big brass wheel that opened the spigot underneath to kind of drain out some of the water from time to time. And he gave it a turn. And he gave it another, because it was kind of rusty. It hadn't been open for a while. And water started pouring out. Edie's dad couldn't believe it. The water poured out onto the ground, and it went into a huge puddle, and all of those reindeer raced over and started drinking the water. And the man with a white beard put his hands up, and poured the water into his hands. And the water was wonderful. And so did Edie's dad. He tried the water. The water was better than he'd ever tasted before. He was amazed as the water kept pouring out. He just stared at it, and then he realized he better turn it off while they could still have the water. So he closed it off. Well, meanwhile, the fellow with the white beard said, well, thank you very much. I probably need to get on my way here. And then he looked over Edie's dad's shoulder and said, is that Edie over there? Edie's eyes got as big as saucers. How did he know my name? Said the man with the white beard. Oh, I know you, but you better go home and get to bed and go to sleep, or Santa won't come. Well, at that point in time, that man gathered all of his reindeer and tied them to a sleigh that was back around behind the water tank. And as he took off, he turned around and said, Merry Christmas. And as he disappeared, Edie's dad looked over at Edie and shook his head and looked up at the water tank that was so pretty as a Christmas-like present. And that water tank was absolutely full. And for the rest of the spring and winter, they had water for the crops and water for the animals until the rains finally come. And that's the story of Nicholas, Colorado.